Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Arise with Sally Goodwin. It's good to see you again. And thank you so much for tuning in. And just, on that note, just thank you so very, very much to all of you who watch me so faithfully, who tune in on a Tuesday, on a Thursday, who've developed an interest in the Hebrew calendar and the Hebrew alphabet from listening to me, who just support me and watch me and comment and send me information and message me and reach out to me. I honestly appreciate each and every one of you because, well, without you, this would all be pointless. And obviously, I trust that all the messages God gives me, speak to each one of you, and that you hear the messages that are meant specifically for you, and that helps you to move forward into what God has for you. Because that is my big thing, is I just want particularly women to just be empowered and activated and inspired and motivated to step into everything God has for them, no matter how scary it looks or how daunting it looks or anything like that. So, because we're all Esthers actually, and we all get to step into destiny and purpose the way she did. So on that note, we are still looking at Esther, and we have moved on from where that famous Esther 4:14 about were you born for such a time as this? And we all know, because God knew when we were going to be born, he knew us before the foundations of the earth were even laid. So we have all been born for such a time as this, and we all get an opportunity to stand up for what we believe in at some point in time. So we've moved on. So Esther has agreed that she will approach the king, whether she lives, whether she dies. And Mordecai goes away, and he gets all the Jewish people in Shushan, in the capital of Persia, to fast for 3 days. Again, bearing in mind that they've had Passover, they're in the month of Passover, the month where they celebrate Passover. So they are celebrating God's deliverance of the Jews, and now they're going to get to relive it again, even though they don't yet know exactly what that's going to look like. So on the third day of the fast, so it's been 3 days, no food, no water for all the Jewish people in Shushan, and Esther and her court. Esther, on the third day of the fast, she puts on her royal robes, and she goes and she stands in the royal or inner court of the king's palace opposite his throne room. And he was sitting on his throne facing the main entrance of the palace. Now, we know this, but just remembering again that the law stated that no one could come before the king unless the king called them, no matter who that was, and that if someone came before the king without being called, they could be put to death immediately, unless he reached out his golden scepter to you. And again, we remember that Ahasuerus, Xerxes, he was incredibly volatile. He seemed to have a personality where no one actually knew how he was going to react to anything, so no one could ever be sure of what he would do. However, God was on this, and God was with Esther. And when the king saw Esther the queen standing in the court, she obtained favor in his sight, and he held out to her the golden scepter that was in his hand. So Esther drew near and touched the tip of the scepter. And, again, when you read through the book of Esther, just see the amount of times it talks about the fact that both Mordecai and Esther and the Jewish people gained favor. They gained favor. So it was what they did, the way they lived, the way they, held themselves, the way they carried themselves, they gained favor. And understand also that must have taken a ferocious courage, a courage and ferocity that I think we sometimes miss when we speak about Esther. We think of Deborah like leading, with Barak leading the armies of Israel into battle, and we think that looks like courage. But I'm telling you, courage is standing in front of the king, not knowing whether you're going to live or die, pleading on behalf of your people. So the king reaches out his golden scepter. Esther touches the tip of the scepter, and the king then asks her, what does she want? And he says he will give it to her even if it's half of the kingdom. So he will give her half of the kingdom, whatever it is that she asks for. And I mean, in that moment, I wonder how many of us would be like, he doesn't know I'm Jewish. I could actually get half the kingdom. Think of the good I could do if I got half the kingdom. I could help, but she was there to save the Jews, and she had to remember that. So sometimes there's good things that are offered to us that aren't the God things, or we see a solution which could be a good solution, but it's not a God solution. And we need to be sure that we are partnering with the God thing and the God solution. And then the amazing thing is that she doesn't then say to him immediately, this has happened and all of that kind of thing. She says that would he and Haman, this enemy of the Jews, actually come for dinner? And you've got to think to yourself, I wonder why she waited. But again, we're just reminded that she's a Benjamite and God has given her prophetic revelation. Look, it doesn't say anywhere that God specifically told her to say that, but I guarantee you that he was there and he was giving her wisdom and revelation. Through Mordecai, he was giving her wisdom and revelation. And so she had prophetic revelation, warfare strategies. This was part of a strategy. It wasn't just she stood in front of the king and now she couldn't think what to ask. So she says, come for dinner. She had a strategy. And you can tell that in terms of the fact that she invites Haman and the king, and they come to her for dinner. And when they're there, the king immediately asks her what it is that she wants. And again, he offers her half the kingdom. And she says to him, you know what, I would love for you and Haman to come for dinner again tomorrow night. And so the king says, absolutely, they'll come again the next night. And Haman goes away and he just thinks he's now the bee's knees because he's had this dinner, intimate dinner with just Esther and the king, and he's all joyful and elated until he walks past Mordecai, and Mordecai still doesn't bow and scrape before him. And so he goes home, Haman goes home, and he calls his friends and his wife and everyone, and he tells them how, everyone thinks he's this amazing person and he's like been treated to this intimate dinner with the king and the queen, and yet he cannot enjoy any of it because Mordecai refuses to bow before him. I mean, just this one thorn in his flesh, And so his wife and his friends say to him, you know what? Go and order a gallows to be erected, and then tomorrow morning go to the king and tell the king that Mordecai needs to be hanged from the gallows. I mean, just like that. And so he's merry again. He's happy, and it says that the thing pleased Haman, and he caused the gallows to be made, just like that. So now you're like, okay. So the pace of the story is starting to move a little bit faster. Things are starting to accelerate. But God is always ahead. So God is previous and he is ahead of things here. And that particular night, the night that Haman decided that the next day he was going to go and ask the king to hang Mordecai, the king can't sleep. That particular night, the king can't sleep. And so he orders that the book of Chronicles, or the book of all the memorable deeds, be brought to him and read to him. And obviously, that made him fall asleep listening to all the deeds and the ongoings in the court. But while he was awake and listening, they read out the story of what happened when Mordecai, told Esther about the eunuchs and who wanted to assassinate the king and how he saved the king's life. And the king suddenly remembers that, was Mordecai, rewarded for that? Was he honored in any way? And his servants say, no, he wasn't. And so the king's thinking, now, what can he do for Mordecai to show his appreciation for that thing that happened that he had completely forgotten about? And he then says to his servants, who is in the court? And Haman had just come into the court, all ready to ask the king to hang Mordecai. But before he can say anything, the king says to him, what shall be done for a man whom the king delights to honor? And Haman, of course, thinks that that is him. He thinks that King Ahasuerus or King Xerxes is thinking of him. He's like, who else could he possibly want to honor except me? So he goes into this whole long explanation about all the things that he obviously would like, the way he would like to be honored by the king. And he must go on his horse, the king's horse, and with the royal apparel, and one of the most noble princes must lead the horse around, and they must proclaim before him, thus shall it be done to the man whom the king delights to honor. And so in his mind, you can just imagine he's picturing himself in splendor and honor and all of this happening to him. And then the king says to him, make haste and do exactly as you've said for Mordecai the Jew, who sits at the king's gate. Leave out nothing that you have spoken. And now Haman gets to do this for Mordecai. And he has to do it So he goes and he does everything that he so wanted done for himself. He goes and he does it for Mordecai so that Mordecai is honored. And then it says that he hastens to his house mourning and having his head covered. And he's telling his wife and his friends about all of this. And they say to him, if Mordecai, before whom you have begun to fall, is of the offspring of the Jews, you cannot prevail against him, but shall surely fall before him. And I wondered, because he knew Mordecai was a Jew, that was why Mordecai wouldn't bow to him. He knew that that was why he decided to wipe out all the Jews. But now suddenly his wife and his friends and his advisors are saying to him, yeah, but if he is the offspring of the Jews, you cannot prevail against him. So I don't know why they suddenly had this change of heart or why they suddenly thought, you're not going to be able to win this one. I'm not sure what happened there, but somehow they seem to suddenly think that he's not actually going to be able to defeat Mordecai So, while they're still talking about this, so they haven't managed to get to the end of it, the end of the conversation, the king's attendees come and they quickly take Haman away to the dinner that Esther had prepared. So here we are back again, second night in a row, and the king and Haman have come to dine with Esther the queen. And again, the king says to Esther, when the wine is being served, what is your petition, Queen Esther? It shall be granted. What is your request? Even to the half of the kingdom, it shall be performed. And this is when Queen Esther says to him, if I have found favor in your sight, O king, and if it pleases the king, let my life be given me at my petition, and my people at my request. And she still says to him, even if we are sold as slaves, if we were going to be sold as slaves, I would keep my mouth shut. I wouldn't say a word. I would accept whatever affliction was going to be put on us. But you actually want to wipe us out. And the king is, you would think that he would think. But anyway, the king is like, who is he and who dares, who is he who dares to do this? And she says, even the wicked Haman. And it says that Haman was afraid before the king and the queen. And once again, the king arose from the feast in his wrath and went into the palace garden. So he had another one of those angry, bad, outbursts of temper, of wrath. And he storms into the palace garden to obviously think this through or calm himself down or and in that, Haman sees an opportunity to throw himself at the mercy of Queen Esther. And so he literally physically throws himself, in front of her as the king comes back in. The king thinks Haman is trying to force himself on her or is trying to assault her or something. And immediately the servants cover Haman's face, which means that that's done. And then the servant says to him, the servant says to the king, Haman has erected this gallows for Mordecai. Because Mordecai found favor, they liked him. And the king said, hang him on it. So they hanged Haman on the gallows that he had prepared for Mordecai. And then the king's wrath was pacified. Takes a fair amount to pacify the king's wrath. So there are a few things that I just want to point out there. So firstly, the question I asked the Lord is, why did they have to have two banquets? I don't understand why she didn't just ask him the first night, why she suddenly felt that she needed to wait a night and ask him the next night, and knowing that God would have given her prophetic revelation, he would have given her prophetic strategy. So I researched and I looked into a whole lot of things that, that the various scholars and various researchers and various theologians have found out. And so there is a school of thought that states that King Xerxes was a heavy drinker. And when he was intoxicated, he was easier to persuade, easier to manipulate, or whatever. And they say that in the first banquet, the moment they sat down, he asked her what she wanted. But in the second banquet, it was only when they were serving the wine he asked her. So some people believe that Esther he wasn't drunk enough the first time, basically, and she waited for him to be a bit more drunk before she put this whole thing before him. And it could have been that. We don't know. But then there is another school of thought that said that God had other things set in place already, bearing in mind that this all occurred, in the month of Nisan over Passover. And apparently, if you go back and you look at dates and times and all of those sorts of things, and again, the argument is made that Esther was a good, God-fearing Jewess, which we know because it said that it says that in the book of Esther. So she would have known, the feasts. She would have known all the stories, of when God's saving of the Israelites over the various, periods of time. She would have known all of that. She would have known where they were in terms of the month that they were in and the date that they were the date of the banquets. And according to all of that, Haman was hanged on the gallows on the same day that Pharaoh and the Egyptian army were swallowed up by the Red Sea. So if you looked at the fact that the Jewish people have been celebrating Passover, which Passover happened, remember, when all the firstborn of the Egyptians were killed, and then they were all, they left Egypt, and then they were fleeing from the Egyptians, and God opened up the Red Sea, and they crossed over, and the Egyptians tried to cross over, and so according to all of that, if you look back at all of those things, he was hanged on that very same day that God destroyed the Pharaoh and the Egyptian army in the Red Sea. And these scholars say that Esther would have known that. She would have known that day, the day that had happened. And so she actually deliberately, when she only had this one chance to see the king when he extended his golden scepter. So she wanted to make sure that, he came to her and spent time with her because she hadn't seen him for a month, remember? And so, but she wanted to wait until that day that God had delivered the Israelites from the Egyptians for them to be delivered. Like, she would have known possibly that the day of deliverance, the date of the deliverance was important, or, so there is a school of thought that believes that she knew, and so she deliberately extended it by another day to make sure that their deliverance came on the day that deliverance had come for the Israelites from the Egyptian army. Now, as I say, there are always people who agree and people who disagree. And you can find both sides of those stories. But to me, it just looks like something God would do. It just seems like something God would do, that God would set it up like that. It just seems like a God plan, set in motion, and another one of those mysteries that he just waits for us to uncover, So I choose to believe that is the way it would be, because I know God loves to bring things full circle, and he loves to work in specific times. So Haman's hanged, and now we have the king, and he gives the house of Haman to Queen Esther, and Mordecai comes before the king because Esther had now told the king who Mordecai was to her. So she would have now acknowledged, obviously she's acknowledged she's a Jew, and she tells the king who Mordecai is, and he takes off his signet ring and he gives it to Mordecai, and and Esther sets Mordecai over the house of Haman. So Mordecai now is in authority. He carries authority. He's been shown extreme favor. He has been vindicated, completely vindicated by God. Okay, so he has gone from being the man in sackcloth and ashes, rending his clothes and crying with a loud cry outside the king's gates, to actually being in charge, to being the highest. Remember, Haman was the highest. Mordecai is now the highest. But now there's still a problem, because in those days, a decree that was made by the king, a decree that was made and signed off by the king and sealed with his signet ring, could not be reversed. The law actually stated that a king's decree at that time could not be reversed. I mean, and when you have a king as volatile as Xerxes, you wonder why. But anyway, so now Esther goes to the king again, and she falls at his feet, and she sought him with tears. So now she's gone to him again without being called. She's taken the risk now. It's the second time. of not being called. Again, she stands before him without being called. Again, he holds the golden scepter out to her. Again, she's now falling at his feet in tears and trembling, and she asks him, can he reverse what Haman has done? Because still that edict that said that all the Jews were going to be slaughtered on this specific day, that was still there. That couldn't be reversed. So Haman was gone, but there was still a leftover of him. And he obviously also, he had his supporters, he had 10 sons, so I mean, the individual is gone, but a lot of people who thought like him were still left. So she stands before the king and she pleads with him, and he says that he will send another letter, another edict, another decree out to all the 127 provinces, to every person in their own script and in their own language, and even to the Jews according to their writing and according to their language. So this happens in the month of Sivan. So the king's scribes were called in the 3rd month, the month of Sivan, and it was written. And the month of Sivan is another very interesting, well, I mean, they're all interesting months. I think I say that every single time, literally, about everything. But I just do find it all incredibly interesting. So the month of Sivan is a month of revelation. It is the month of going from strength to strength. It's a month of acceleration. It is the month of mercy and alignment, because it's the month of Zebulun, the tribe of Zebulun. It is the month where restoration is accelerated, and it is the month where we celebrate Pentecost. So it is an incredible month, and their strength, their acceleration, their restoration, all of that came in the month of Sivan. And so this edict goes out. And remember when the king sent that previous thing out about all the languages and, if you've married a foreign wife, she has to speak your language. And now it says that he sent to every script in their own language and to the Jews according to their writing and according to their language. So he's kind of gone back for, he's stopped all that stuff about the language stuff, and he's now speaking to everybody in their own language. And it's in that edict, it says in it, the king granted the Jews who were in every city to gather and defend their lives, to destroy, to slay, and to wipe out any armed force that might attack them, their little ones and women, and to take the enemy's goods for spoil. And this was sent out. So the writing, the decree was said that basically what had been meant to happen to the Jews were now allowed to defend themselves. They were allowed to actually be on the offensive instead of on the defensive. On that same day, the 13th of Adar, that Haman had meant for all the Jews to be slaughtered. Now King Xerxes issues this decree that the Jewish people can actually rise up themselves, and they can actually defend themselves, and they can, whatever enemies they fight against, they can take their spoils. And so this is now a full reversal of what had happened. And I think, that sometimes it seems also bloodthirsty. And I think sometimes, when you read in the next sort of chapter about, all the people that were killed and everything, you're like, oh my goodness. But at the same time, you forget that was the intention for all the Jews to be slaughtered, So now the Jews are doing it, and we're all like, oh my goodness, but why? But they were actually defending themselves, because that edict, the first edict to kill all the Jews, couldn't be reversed. So I guarantee you that there were people in the outlying cities and villages and the unwalled cities, as they talk about in the Bible, who were still going to try. They were still going to be like, they were looking at their Jewish neighbors thinking, I wouldn't mind that, So they were still going to try. The difference was that now the Jews could defend themselves. They could actually rise up themselves and defend themselves, and also take spoils and plunder if it so happened. So it's not a case of, seeing it so much but remembering what was supposed to happen. Now what happened was the Jews, the playing field was leveled, basically. What God did was he leveled the playing field. And it just says that the Jews had light, a dawn of new hope and gladness and joy and honor. And it says that wherever the king's command and his decree came, the Jews had gladness and joy, a feast and a holiday. And many from among the peoples of the land submitted themselves to Jewish rite and became Jews, for the fear of the Jews had fallen upon them. Bearing in mind that the Jewish people were definitely a lesser. There weren't as many of them, and they were in exile and they were spread, through the whole kind of 127 provinces. And yet the fear of the Jews was so much that some of the people there actually became Jews before this all happened. Before the Adar happened, they converted to Judaism because the fear and the favor was on the Jewish people. So we are now fully into the whole story, and all the things have happened, and all the people have played out their roles, and now we get to the final act, and we're going to have to do that next week because I ran out of time. So message me if you want to comment on any of this, but otherwise I'll see you next week. Bye.